welcome to our next installment in the SMPTE Standards webcast series. Today's topic, SMPTE Standards 101. I'm your host, Joel Welch, Director of Professional Development for SMPTE. Welcome, everybody. If you're new to SMPTE Standards series, it is a series of educational webcasts that is separate and apart from our SMPTE PDA Now webcast. We present our standards webcasts quarterly, and they're designed to inform people who are interested in SMPTE standards development efforts, and they're intended to help people understand what the SMPTE standards are about and the process for developing them. And today's webcast will specifically talk about the process. It is open to members and non-members alike. There is no charge, and they are live webcasts, but we do capture them for on-demand playback. Upcoming standards webcasts in August, we will have motion picture metadata, Beyond the Basics, and in November, Interoperable Master Format, or IMF. Today's very special guest speaker is Peter Symes, Director of Standards and Engineering. He's on staff at SMPTE. And Peter, they came here to listen to you and not me. So with that, I'll hand the floor over to you.
And thank you, Joel, and good day to everyone. We're going to talk today about the SMPTE Standards process and how it works, why it's important, and how you can participate. I'm going to first of all talk about the different sorts of standards bodies, and I must be honest here, seeing that Bob Edge is online, the first few slides you'll see are adapted from some Bob put together a few years ago, but produce a very useful primer on what sort of standards bodies are around. There are treaty organizations, of which the one that's relevant to our industry is really the ITU, the International Telecommunications Union. Members of ITU, the voting members, are governments. This is really important for things that involve, for example, radio frequency spectrum, because spectrum does not abide by national boundaries, and so there has to be the force of law in each country for standards to be enforced. So for things like ITU, the members are governments, administrations. Organizations like SMPTE and commercial companies may be sector members but don't have a direct vote. ITU produces recommendations like BT 601, which was derived from SMPTE 125M, and also ITUT, the telecommunications, publishes H.264, for example, which is derived from MPEG 4 Part 10. So it's a sort of largely a derivative process. Then there are international standards bodies. ISO and IEC are the real examples here. And here the members are countries again, but rather than directly the administrations, they are national bodies set up by a national organization such as ANSI in the United States, AFNOR in France, DIN in Germany, and so on. Each country gets one vote, and the national body determines what that vote will be, and they develop international standards. Then there are accredited standards organizations. These are things like technical societies, such as SMPTE, that are accredited by some organization, in our case ANSI, that says we've got to run by a set of formal procedures and rules that are usually based on some model such as the ANSI rules, such that we're due process organizations so that the process is determined and minority opinions have to be considered and addressed before standards can be created. Then there's quite a lot of organizations in this category like SMPTE and ETSI, W3C, IEEE, so on. And one of the things is that participants may be companies or they may be individuals, and there must not be excessive financial barriers to participation. That's in contrast sometimes to trade associations, where typically a relatively small number of companies get together, generally produce things very quickly for a given sector of the industry, and sometimes indeed do limit participation by having relatively high, like tens of thousands of dollars, membership fees that allow them to essentially restrict the membership to those who are really serious and immediately concerned with the results. And then finally in this group there's end user organizations such as EBU and IRT, who specifically represent the needs of users and may indeed have their own recommendations and codes of practice, but also represent very important inputs to the standards process in organizations such as SMPTE. So the big picture, there are treaty organizations, organizations like ISO, organizations like SMPTE, trade associations and end-user organizations. They all have their own strengths and they all represent important parts of the big picture. One of the, as I said, SMPTE in this case falls in as an accredited standards body. We're accredited by ANSI. We're also recognized as an ARO, that's an approved reference organization by ITU, by IEC TC100, by SC29, which is the parent body of MPEG and JPEG. ARO means that these organizations recognize SMPTE as having a valid due process system for creating standards, and therefore they can reference SMPTE documents in anything they do without having to explicitly form an approval of that particular SMPTE document. We develop standards for motion pictures, digital cinema, television, everything from the sprocket holes in 35mm film to ultra high definition television. Most of our committee members represent a company, but they contribute as individuals, and we do have a significant number of individual contributors. Our application areas include acquisition, contribution, post-production, distribution, station operations, theatre operations, de-cinema packaging, you name it. And the rules within SMPTE say that anything that's within our space and meet established criteria, and where there is committed effort to do the work, we will accept that project. I said that all of the organizations are important, and cooperation is really important to getting standards done. I show here just some of the organizations with which SMPTE interacts. Sometimes we take specific input, say from AMPAS, the Academy of Motion Picture Arts and Sciences, will bring drafts that they have created to SMPTE for putting through our due process and eventually publication as a standard. In other cases like MPEG, MPEG creates the real standards for the MPEG compression systems, obviously. SMPTE puts requirements into MPEG and also creates documents, typically recommended practices, that constrain particular applications of MPEG. And there are many different examples, but the important thing is that we all have to cooperate within the set of bodies that I've shown you, and in many different ways. So let's talk about how SMPTE standards happen, what the organization is and the process for creating them. We have a number of committee types. Just from an organizational point of view, we have a group called the Standards Community, and this is the umbrella group that everybody joins if they want to take part in the SMPTE standards process. The only real impact of this is that when you join the Standards Community, that's the stage at which you are asked to read and acknowledge our agreement for participation that says, for example, if you're aware of patents that apply to a document we're discussing, you must tell us, and that you mustn't go and publish the proceedings of our committees and so on. You must respect a degree of confidentiality, because we want to be able to have free-ranging discussions that people don't get reported out of context, and also there's a great danger in incomplete documents being circulated because people tend to adopt them without realizing they're not complete. So we do ask for that agreement from everybody who participates, and once you're in the standards community you have accepted that agreement, and you can then join any other of our committees without any further formality. most of the work takes place in the technology committees, or the formal work. These are the due process committees. There are currently 10 of them, each covering a specific field of technology. Within each technology committee, we can have working groups and ad hoc groups. Working groups typically handle a subset of the technology committee's remit, sometimes just very useful to group a number of work items together, or some projects may be large and have a number of sections in themselves and are worthy of having a working group to help coordinate the work. The ad hoc groups are where a lot of the real detail works take place. We form them as needed. They might be large or small, they might live for a short term or a long term, but they're basically where we get a group of experts together to draft the documents and deal with comments and so on. And then finally we have a committee called the Standards Committee, which oversees the work of the standards process. It consists of all the technology committee chairs plus some invited and some statutory members. We're responsible in the standards committee for the overall organization and also do a process audit for each document before it goes to publication to make sure that the rules have been obeyed.
Peter, can you take a question?
Certainly.
Angelo asks, one of the goals of any standard is to reach interoperability. What is the level of interoperability between standardization organizations, national, international, etc.? And in parentheses he states process, exchange of information, etc.
And as I tried to indicate, it varies a great deal with organizations. Sometimes it's a one-way process where an organization will draft a document and send it to SMPTE and participate in the process of exposing that to a wider audience, as making sure that it's unambiguous, making sure it's not in conflict with other standards, and eventually go through our due process and become a standard. Sometimes it's very informal, we just exchange information. Sometimes it's a leadership exercise. In the case of aspect ratio control, for example, and another one that's ongoing at the moment, which is a question of audio synchronization, audio-video synchronization through a system. SMPTE doesn't control or have the ability to create standards in all of the end-to-end system. So, for example, with aspect ratio control, we needed everything from signal acquisition through the studio process, which is part of SMPTE's remit, into the transmission process that's dealt with organizations such as DVB and ATSC, and into consumer equipment, which in the US is the remit of CEA. SMPTE was instrumental in pulling a lot of organizations together to help the coordination, so that when we came up with an answer, we had standards in each space created by the relevant standards body that meant we had a compatible end-to-end system. And at the moment we're trying to do that with audio-video sync as well. So very, very variable. It depends on the organization and the particular job, and it really can be in any of the things that Angelo mentioned of process, exchange of information, or more formal or leadership. So a tremendous variety of interactions depending on what's going on with what organization. So going back to our ecosystem, here we show the 10 technology committees. If we start over in the top right, that's really where stuff gets created. Might be images, might be sound, might be data, might be metadata. And the 10E Essence Committee is responsible for the things like video formats coming out of cameras, for example. We're more and more seeing the need for metadata to be created along with Essence. So those two committees together are really responsible for the formats and the way in which program material is created. Immediately to the left of that is a committee that really packages this stuff, and probably the most obvious one we're dealing with at the moment is IMF, which is the Interoperable Mastering Format, which is currently going through the SMPTE process, which I'll talk about in a little bit more detail later on. Over on the left-hand side, we have what I regard as the delivery committees, and these are committees that deal with how material is distributed to an end user or an intermediate user. In the case of the 20F committee on conventional film, in the case of 24TB, television and broadband distribution, and 21DC is digital cinema distribution. So these committees deal with standards and practices relevant to those particular distribution mechanisms. Okay, so I was talking about standards that have basic specifications necessary for interoperability, recommended practices to facilitate implementation. So we might have things like constraints. For example, I mentioned that some people wanted to have constrained versions of MPEG for particular uses, and SMPTE produced a recommended practice for that. Engineering guidelines are informative documents, often tutorial. We're actually trying to improve the number of engineering guidelines we have, because as standards get more and more complicated, there's an increasing need for a document that's sort of a 101 introduction to what this group of standards is about. Then we have some registers, usually online tables. So if we have a standard that sets a set of values and we add standards to that, we try and keep the list of current values available in an online register. And then when we want to make minor changes or updates to a published document, we can issue an amendment. So here's a brief overview of the SMPTE process. We have project creation and approval, the informal development stage, final development, and the formal approval. This is where we create an audit trail for the document, the standards committee audit that I discussed before, and then publication. Let's go through these one by one. A project can be proposed within a technology committee, or it may come to SMPTE from an outside source. The engineering vice president, who's my professional boss, will assign this to one of the technology committees, and we then take the write-up of this, circulate it to the TC and to the standards committee. The things we need to decide there are, is this really within SMPTE's scope? If it's, for example, somebody's proposing we standardize something to do with a piece of consumer equipment, no, we're not the right organization to do that. Are we in the correct technology committee? Sometimes when you look at a project in more detail, you realize, yeah, perhaps the original allocation wasn't correct and it really ought to be in a different TC. A very important thing is, are resources available? SMPTE is not a sort of body of expertise and energy that you can just throw something over the wall into SMPTE and hope that something will eventually come out. If you have a project that needs to be done, part of the getting this project started is to find the resources who will work on it. Then we look in detail at the scope and the work plan. Are they okay? Very often we get suggestions to refine this, or to limit it, or to extend it, depending on exactly what's going on. And then we have this test of, does it meet what we call colloquially the 9 commandments? These are the criteria set out in our rules for engineering documents. There must be potential for use. We're not into just doing theoretical stuff. We must make sure that we're not conflicting with an existing recognized national or international standard. That doesn't mean that we might not provide an alternative approach, but we can't create, if there's an international standard that says a 35mm film shall have these size sprocket holes, we can't produce a standard saying no, they shall have these size sprocket holes instead. Generally, it must be in the public interest. That's a rather vague thing, but we want to make sure that there's generally a feeling that doing this work would be a good thing and not, restricting competition or doing something like this. It shall be, we shall not have any evidence that we're going to do something that would be unfair to some section of the industry. Clearly needs to be evidence of technical adequacy. We should be technically adequate. We have to comply with our intellectual property policy. This doesn't mean there can't be patents that apply to our standards. If you say that the standards cannot have any patented technology in them, all you generally say is that the only standards you create are based on 20-year-old technology, and de facto implementations would transcend the standards anyway. But if there are patents involved in a standard, there has to be a disclosure of them, and these patents have to be available for reasonable and non-discriminatory licensing. We're not involved in comparative ratings of competitive systems and products, and we're not there to produce purchase specifications. Of course, purchase specifications may reference a SMPTE standard, but the purpose of the documents is not to create purchase specifications. Assuming all that lot's okay, we move into the informal development stage. We create or get from somebody a draft document, and the interested experts in the project team, which might be in an ad hoc group, review this draft, typically work over a period of at least weeks, sometimes longer, to review and modify that document to try and get the best ideas from everyone, and a document that's coherent and understandable, and unambiguous. They create what we call a working draft, and this then goes to a wider review. We send it to the whole of the technology committee for review, so that when we get a greater number of people looking at it, still at the informal level, we may get suggestions for improving the document, and that goes back to the project team who may look at those comments and decide are the things from the comments that they should incorporate to improve the document. Once they're happy that they've gone as far as they can, the document's sent to the technology committee as a committee draft. And this is where we go on record. This is the start of the formal due process, and everything that happens now must be part of the audit trail that we create for this document. We ballot this CD for approval as a final committee draft. This is a formal ballot, generally 5 weeks in duration, and anyone may in the committee may comment, and all of the comments are formally recorded. They have to be addressed, and we have to reach some resolution of that comment before we can go forward. 99% of the time, there's a discussion between the commenter and the authors of the document, and an agreement that says either no, the comment wasn't appropriate, or that the document is changed to address the comment, and that the person making the comment is happy with the solution. Very occasionally we reach a stage where there really can't be an agreement, and on these occasions we have to resolve the comment by an override vote, which requires 75% of the technology committee to say, no, we really are going to override this comment, because even though it may be a valid minority opinion, it is a minority opinion, and we need to move forward. Having completed all the comment resolution, if the document may have been changed, and we need to send it out for comment again, because some of the people who are originally happy, it's conceivable that the changes have, so far as they're concerned, broken the document. Usually this doesn't take place, because all the commenters and authors typically are involved in the comment resolution process, and hopefully the document that's created meets everybody's need. But there has to be a final check, and that's what we call a ballot to draft publication, DP, to sort of just really says, is everybody now happy with the document after all the revisions? Assuming that passes, that draft publication goes to the Standards Committee for the audit that I talked about, and the Standards Committee looks at the document and the audit trail and says, well, did we meet all the due process? Was this handled correctly? Was indeed consensus achieved on the final committee draft? Were all the comments resolved? Was there consensus for approval of the draft publication? Have we met all the criteria? Whether normative references are all appropriate? If there were patents raised about this document, have we got all the patent statements from the patent holders saying that they will indeed do reasonable and non-discriminatory licensing? And if there's any appeal for any of the steps, should this have any impact on the timing of publication? So occasionally questions come back from this audit. Most of the time we have our act together properly and the audit just passes, but it's a very useful cross-check that everything has taken place the way it should in creating this document. And then finally it goes into the publication process at headquarters, where we check the formatting, make sure the boilerplate paragraphs are there, create the metadata that's necessary for the online publication. We send a final version check to the chairs of the technology committee and the document editor to make sure that typos have been picked up, there aren't any errors crept in the preparation of the PDF, and so on. And then finally, when we get the buy-in from those people that the document is indeed as it should be, we publish it to the SMPTE Digital Library. I'll try and come back to the digital library briefly at the end of this thing, but at the moment let me move on, just mention appeals. It is a due process. We have a set of rules, and the idea of the rules in any standards body is that if there are dissenting opinions, that there is an opportunity to express those opinions, for those opinions to be properly discussed, and for the committee to make a decision taking into account any minority position. That doesn't mean the minority position has to be adopted. Sometimes it's not, sometimes there's a compromise achieved, but we absolutely have to make sure that any minority opinion was recognized and that we did deal with it properly. If someone feels they had a dissenting view and that we did not deal with it properly, they have the right to appeal. First of all, the appeal goes to the Standards Committee, and in the Standards Committee we will reach a consensus either that the appeal should be allowed and that the process should go back into the Technology Committee to handle it properly, or that no, the Technology Committee did handle the process correctly and that the appeal should be rejected. If the appellant thinks the Standards Committee didn't satisfactorily resolve the issue, there is the ability also to appeal then to the Board of Governors. So that's a quick rundown of the process. How do you participate? Generally speaking, most people who participate, in fact I think today probably all of them, are SMPTE members. We do ask that they be at the professional membership level, and in general pay an additional fee that's currently $200 a year that helps cover some of the costs of the standards program. There are exemptions from this fee, and if you're a self-supported volunteer just participating in the standards for the good of the industry and not actively making money in the industry, then we can waive the fee. Similarly, as a due process accredited standards body, we cannot actually and do not require that you actually join the society, so there is the ability to participate as a non-member. Clearly most people choose to do it the other way. The costs of non-member participation are slightly higher than doing so as a member, but not a lot of difference. Once you've paid the standards participation fee or had an exemption, you then go and join the standards community. That's the umbrella group I talked about, and that's where we ask you to accept the participation agreement for all the rules of how we work. Once you join the standards community, you can join any or all of the technology committees. once you're in a technology committee, you can join any of its subgroups. It's a hierarchical system. We don't want people in subgroups who aren't part of the final due process that takes place in the technology committee. So to join a subgroup, you have to be a member of its parent. In the technology committee, we have two levels of participation. And this is an important point because we do need to ensure that the consensus body, as we call it, we have a substantial proportion of that consensus body approving every document we produce. But there are people in the technology committees who make very real contributions, but who don't feel that they can keep up the level of obligation of attending meetings and voting on all the ballots to be a participating member, to be part of the consensus body. So when you join a technology committee, you do so as an observer, what we call an O member. After attending at least one meeting, if you so request, you can become a participating member, P member, and the P members form the consensus body for that technology committee. So you must attend meetings, and you mustn't miss more than 2 consecutive meetings, or, I'm sorry, an error in the slide, you must not miss more than 3 consecutive ballots. If you do, then your P status is revoked unless there are special circumstances. Because, as I say, we do have requirements that for a document to go forward, we need to have had affirmative votes from at least half of the consensus body, so people who don't vote represent a very real problem. So if you choose to remain as an observer, or if your status is, you're demoted to observer because of non-participation, you're still a member of the technology committee. You may not vote, but you can still comment on any ballot. And if you make a comment, your comment has to be addressed and resolved just as if you were a voting member. So you can still do a very meaningful level of participation, even though you're not actually a member of the consensus body as we define it. Participation in working groups and ad hoc groups is informal, so everybody is equal status. Any ballot, we may use the ballot tool for collecting opinions, but it's all informal, not part of the audit trail. And there are no specific requirements for maintaining membership, but as I say, to be a member of a group, you need to be a member of its parent and eventually a member of the technology committee within which that group is a part. To facilitate the process, we use web services called Covey Workspace, created by Covey Corporation, a company in Portland, Oregon, for the standards development. For each project, we're still bringing this online fully, but for each project we create a project in the Covey Workspace, and this is where we define the scope of the project, the work plan, the timeline, and collect together any assigned groups that are working on this, all the documents, all the ballots, so that the project provides a complete timeline and history and audit trail of a particular project, which may be one or more documents. Each committee, be it a technology committee or a working group or an ad hoc group, has what's a group within the Covey structure, and that provides a roster, those who are members of that group, provides a document repository, a calendar for meetings and other events, an email reflector so that it's easy for all of the members of that group to talk to each other by email, and a ballot facility that can be used both for informal, straw man polls, or for the formal ballots that take place in the technology committees and the standards committee. Obviously, committees have to have meetings of one form or another. We aim within SMPTE to get most of the real work done by virtual meetings. We provide telephone conferences and web meetings, and many groups meet weekly, some less frequently than that, some unfortunately a lot less frequently than that. But this is how the majority of the work is supposed to get done. It may be that a group working like that finishes its draft document and can just send it on to the technology committee, and that's really the end of it until we get into the commenting process. Sometimes a group will realize that there are particular issues that need to be addressed before they can complete their work, where a face-to-face meeting is really essential. So once a quarter we hold a block meeting. All of the technology committees, actually except the film technology committee that tends to meet in a separate location, but all the other technology committees have their plenary meetings during this block, and typically all of the working groups will meet during this block, and any ad hoc groups that need to have a face-to-face meeting, as I've just discussed, to resolve particular issues, will all meet during a week of meetings. These meetings are hosted typically by a manufacturer or user. Recently we've been to Turner Entertainment Network in Atlanta, hosted our meetings in March. ESPN is going to host them in July. EBU is going to host in September in Geneva, and Harris Corporation is going to host us in Melbourne, Florida in December. So you see we have manufacturers and users contributing to this. Typically we hold 2 or 3 meetings each year in North America, and either 1 or 2 internationally. There's always one in Europe after IBC, and typically in alternate years we hold another one in some other continent than North America. That will probably become more of our meetings as we get more and more international participation. So I want to spend a few minutes talking about some few highlights of some of the things we're doing. Of course, highlights is different for everybody. But here's some of the ongoing projects. Ultra high definition television was brought to SMPTE for the initial standards. They probably need some more work now with things that have been changing recently, but what they provided was a sort of common set of standards so that anybody who wanted to work on ultra high definition television didn't have to argue about whether it was 7,000 pixels or 8,000 pixels. That there was a set of basic parameters that people agreed to work to, even though research may have gone in different directions within those constraints. We're doing a lot of work with 3 gigabit interfaces and their uses, with various aspects of fiber interfaces, video over IP. We've got 4 documents out already and 2 more in process. MXF, the file format for interchange that was published by SMPTE some years ago, has continually evolved, generally in ways that make it easier for people to use and to clarify ambiguities that turned out in very, very complex standards. But there's continuing work on MXF, and that's making it a more and more versatile platform the more we move forward. BXF, the broadcast exchange format, was one of the major success stories of SMPTE in recent years. This was started by Chris Lennon from Harris Corporation as a mechanism for traffic systems to talk to automation systems. We had a very, very wide participation. I think there were over 80 companies participating at one stage, and they've evolved a very sophisticated XML-based communication systems for different systems to talk to each other. And not only are more and more companies adopting this for communications, but more and more capabilities are being discussed that is resulting in a version 2 just published in the last few weeks, and a version 3 all backward compatible with the original, but with increased capabilities being worked on now. Digital cinema, a major project for SMPTE, of course, because it's not very often that you get to reinvent a 100-year-old business. Again, continual work going on now. In particular, we're looking at higher frame rates for stereoscopic movies, and a study group working on that at the moment. I mentioned briefly earlier on the interoperable mastering format. This is some work that came out of the Entertainment Technology Committee, fronted very largely by Disney, and is based on some of the work that we did for digital cinema. It basically says that if you're distributing programs, you typically have to create a very large number of versions based on the distribution channel, the language, many factors result in, maybe 50, 60, 70 versions of a program. IMF provides a mechanism where you can store and transfer all the basic assets that make up this program, the various video segments, possibly alternate segments for different audiences for some parts of the program, the sound, maybe different languages, subtitles, so on. Gather all those together, and then for each version that's to be distributed, you just create a content playlist, which is another XML document that says how do you go to which of these asset files do you go to, and how do you assemble them to produce this particular version of the program. It's worked incredibly well for digital cinema. The work's progressing very rapidly within SMPTE for IMF, and again it's going to be a really important set of standards for the industry going forward. Another one that I think is going to be particularly important is the archive exchange format. There are a lot of archiving systems around. Some of them are dependent on specific storage media, and that's a problem because these things come and go very quickly in the IT industry. And some of them are very dependent on the specific system used to create the archive. The archive exchange format work is intending to present a wrapper so that any manufacturer that wants to be conformant to AXF can look at this wrapper, create it within the confines of their particular system, so that on any compliant system you can migrate the archive between one storage media and another in a simple, reliable way, and that if perchance the manufacturer of the archive system you bought goes away, if it was an AXF compliant system, you're going to be able to recover that archive with any other AXF compliant system. Also, it's going to make sure that, if the archive was represented by several data tapes and one of them gets lost, you'll be able to recover the part of the archive that still exists and not make the whole thing useless because part of it gets lost. Given the value of archives that are being recognized more and more today, we think this is a really important bit of work, and looking forward to seeing the documents coming forward for approval. So, to summarize, the SMPTE Standards process is rule-based to make sure that there's a level playing field for everybody, that everything's evaluated properly, all the minority views are considered. It's based on volunteer committees that make all the technical decisions. It's accessible to everyone who's got a genuine interest. It's accessible to those who can't go to physical meetings. Most of the work takes place in virtual meetings, and all of our technology committee meetings are available for people to participate by phone and web. And it's a constantly improving process. I want to just take a moment before we go to questions to talk about how important this is. Standards are really important to an industry, to both manufacturers and users. They address many areas, but most importantly, they specify how equipments and systems can connect to each other and interact. Now, for manufacturers, this significantly reduces development expense across the industry because things are invented once rather than multiple times. But more critically, for a small manufacturer or one new to the industry, it means they can introduce one or several products that will work in an infrastructure. They don't have to create everything to play in that industry. For users, standards means that they're not forced to buy everything from one manufacturer. There was a time in the television industry where that was exactly the way that happened. You would go to manufacturer A or manufacturer B,
and you would buy everything for the television station, and you probably couldn't go and buy components from another manufacturer to fit into that. So this increases the versatility of the systems they can build, and of course it creates much more competition, because many more manufacturers can play, and this reduces users' costs as well as increasing the versatility of what they can do. And also, and really important to get over, is if users participate in the standards process, that's the way they get equipment and systems that meet their needs. If they just let the manufacturers do it all, it's no use coming back and complaining later on that they didn't do the right thing. Users need to be in the standards process as well to make sure the standards really address the needs of the users. So that's what I wanted to talk to you about this morning.
And with that, I'd like to thank Peter. I'd like to thank you, our guests, and look forward to seeing you next time, either on SMPTE Now or the next SMPTE Standards webcast. Take care, everybody.